The main messages I wanted to share with participants were twofold. One was on the impacts of climate change. We are already experiencing the impacts, and the impacts are diverse. A lot of people think about climate change and mainly think about it's just going to get hotter, we'll have hotter temperatures, we'll have to use more air conditioning. But one thing that I wanted to emphasize and that I'm exploring in some ongoing work is how people are currently experiencing climate change. And it's really not so much about temperature increases, it's more about natural disasters, which we've experienced and we would experience without climate change, but the scientists tell us that more and more natural disasters are getting worse, like winds during hurricanes are stronger, we're having more floods. And in the US, one of the things that we're really experiencing is wildfires. So not just wildfires in the US, which are a problem especially for the people who live near the forest fires, but they're also a problem when the Canadian wildfires are going on. US households experience lots of particulate matter, and particulate matter is associated with bad health and mortality, unfortunately, for some people. So we want to think about kind of these additional impacts of climate change. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is one of my favorite topics, which is carbon pricing and the impacts that the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, has had on really creating a global conversation around carbon pricing. So I'm a big fan of CBAM, and I hope that this global conversation will lead to increased ambition amongst a number of countries, especially those that have embraced carbon pricing. I think researchers have a real imperative to influence policy. Before I went to the government, I used to think that researchers, economic researchers, were kind of this small, hardy band, and we had all these things on our plate. We had to teach in some cases, we had to apply for grants, and occasionally we would do things like write a blog post or write a policy brief that would lob an idea into the policy-making sphere. And I used to think that there was just this whole apparatus of policymakers, that there were thousands and thousands of people, and that economists were kind of being generous with their time when occasionally we gave advice to policymakers. And I now think that it's completely flipped, that policymakers are not this huge band of civil servants, but a small band of civil servants, and they have a million things on their plate. So for instance, I worked for Janet Yellen, and she had to deal with the US macroeconomy coming out of COVID and inflation. She had to deal with the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. She had to deal with financial sanctions on Russia when they invaded Ukraine. She had to deal with legislation that involved the tax code. There are just a million things on one person's plate. And so I now think that policymakers could benefit a lot from researchers being explicit and doing a lot more to kind of communicate to policymakers how our research could be translated into effective policy. For business school students, I actually teach a class at Sloan on climate and energy in the global economy, and there are a couple of messages that I try to communicate to students. One is that you really can't understand the climate tech or climate-related industries or the energy industries without thinking about policy. A former colleague of mine used to describe what he called the stroke of the pen risk, right? If somebody passes legislation, it can expose your company to huge risk. For instance, US investments in renewable energy got a big influx of cash when the Biden administration passed the Inflation Reduction Act, but then recently that was repealed by the Trump administration, and so there are basically kind of huge swings in potential returns. That's an example of this stroke of the pen risk. The other thing that I try to emphasize to students is to think about the scale of things, and you know, if you're interested in addressing climate change, think about, well, how many tons is this endeavor that I'm embarking on? How many tons could I think about taking out of the atmosphere, or you know, prevent from being emitted into the atmosphere? So that's an additional thing that I think it's important for business school students, just to like keep things in perspective. It's always hard to give advice to the younger generation. They're facing a very different world from the one that I faced as a younger person. I think everyone, when giving advice, kind of draws on their own experience. And so I would say the two things that you know, I would highlight that I think have worked for me are to like approach questions and problems with a bit of skepticism, and think, well, you know, people are saying, for instance, when I started doing work on climate change, people were saying that energy efficiency was going to be a huge part of the way that the world addressed climate change. And you know, I thought, well, is that really true? Can we really get, you know, as many reductions as people are saying with energy efficiency? So that, for me, has worked to essentially, you know, question the status quo and push on assumptions that other people are making. And the second thing that's really worked for me is to like get out and see the world, travel to the extent you can. I've been doing work in Africa, so I've gone to Africa for the past, you know, 12, 13 years. And I just feel like every time I go to an African country, I learn something. It's not like I go there with the explicit intent to learn what I learn, but just kind of seeing how people in different environments live, and seeing how different societies are organized, seeing how different policymakers think about things. Yeah, I think you always learn something. So I would encourage those things. Yeah, question the status quo and get out and see the world.